Hello, English 262, Literatures of Memory. I'm Piper.
I'm Victoria.
And we are talking about The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot.
What are we talking about?
We are now going to discuss narration. We discussed this briefly in class, kind of about how we might assume that, first of all, because George Eliot is a woman, that the narrator is a woman.
Right.
And that we assume that, kind of given like the first scene with the narrator looking at Maggie playing, that she, like the narrator could potentially be Maggie from like a future point in her life.
Right.
But that's kind of complicated a little bit in book 2 because a lot of what is being described are scenes and places that Maggie didn't have access to.
So we dive into, instead of this really like close-up look at Maggie, which we get in the first book, we see this view of Tom. And so the problem that we run into, like a Swan's Way-esque problem, like in
Swan and Love.
Right, where we just have to assume that Marceau is telling us the truth about Swan's experience with courting Odette and living in Paris, but he wasn't ever actually there. He's creating it from a memory or a narrative that he already has in mind. So what we're wondering is, if Maggie is our narrator, is she giving Tom the same treatment and making this narrative out of what she has experienced and what she knows to be true about this time?
And how does she like inject herself into like describing a situation that like she wasn't present for? So kind of what are some ways that she might be kind of projecting onto that scene or onto that moment with like her own personal experiences? And then maybe we like come to the conclusion that Maggie isn't our narrator, but if Maggie is our narrator, like how can we see that in like her descriptions of Tom
reflected in book 2.
And then in addition to that, with Tom and Maggie, we kind of have a highly gendered like dichotomy created between the two of them. So a question that we had, we don't know if you guys had it, but why we were kind of confused about how Mr. Tolliver calls Maggie a wench. So we took out the handy dandy OED,
Oxford English Dictionary
plug, and and we discovered that wench
that's so smooth
could mean, it primarily meant a girl, maid, young woman, female child, or a girl of the rustic or working class, and then it was used chiefly in addressing a daughter, wife, or a sweetheart. Kind of was like a familiar term, like almost like a loving term, but we did kind of like, we're kind of thinking about how if it was used or like applied to a girl of the rustic or working class, like what is the importance of that if Mr. Tolliver is using that like to address Maggie.
Right, so we're wondering if by addressing Maggie specifically as a wench all the time and categorizing her as sort of this rustic or working class girl, but never addressing Tom in the same way, and instead arguing about how he needs an education and how he's going to be a lawyer and how he's going to be like this sort of classier gentleman, like how Mr. Tolliver sort of already stereotypes his children into what he believes that they necessarily have to be. So Maggie's going to have to stay at home and be the rustic wench, whereas Tom will go off and become an actual gentleman and a lawyer.
And like how Maggie is like kind of stuck in her particular like place within society, and Tom, like there's this like, at least in Mr. Tolliver's mind, this like hope that he can ascend to a higher class and achieve something. So whereas like for Maggie, it seems like she's kind of stuck in the place that she is, and like she's going to continue to occupy that space. It's not going anywhere. Just because she's intelligent, she still isn't the one chosen to go off and get an education.
Right.
She's limited, and that's just kind of seen as like one of her quirks almost.
Yeah. We're really proud of this.